Why was King Henry VIII so terrified of sleeping with his sister-in-law that he came to believe he had been cursed by God? In 1527, the stone corridors of Whitehall Palace were cold not only from the English winter, but from an atmosphere so suffocating it felt almost dangerous. Amid flickering candlelight and the heavy scent of incense, King Henry VIII, then 36 years old, at the height of his physical vigor, walked with heavy, uneasy steps. Few could have imagined that behind closed oak doors, a plot was taking shape, a plot directed not at foreign enemies, but at the very woman who had shared his bed for 18 years, Catherine of Aragon. The conflict was not merely human, it was theological. Only a few years earlier, Henry himself had written fierce treatises defending Catholic doctrine against Martin Luther, earning from the Pope the exalted title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. Yet now, that same defender was rummaging through aging biblical manuscripts, desperately searching for a legal loophole to tear apart a marriage that the Vatican itself had once blessed. Henry VIII was not, at the beginning, a crude tyrant. He was a man of strange habits and extreme superstition. Chroniclers recorded that the king lived in constant fear of illness, especially the mysterious sweating sickness that had swept England in deadly waves in 1485, 1508, 1517, and 1528. He often prepared his own medicines and wore amulets filled with exotic herbs. But in 1527, his greatest fear was not death, it was divine punishment. Henry became convinced that his failure to produce a male heir was proof that God was furious because he had married his brother's wife. Night after night, he locked himself in his study beneath the light of expensive beeswax candles, muttering verses from Leviticus as if reciting a curse. This was not simply a divorce born of fading love or the youthful beauty of Anne Boleyn, with her dark, enigmatic eyes. It was a political earthquake. If Henry failed, the Tudor dynasty risked collapse in civil war. If he succeeded, he would have to confront the supreme authority of Rome. The certificate of freedom Henry so desperately desired became the spark that ignited a religious revolution, transforming England from a loyal island under papal authority into an independent, separated, and defiant empire. The darkness of 1527 did not fall only upon the fate of an abandoned queen. It was also the dawn of an entirely new England, an England born from stubbornness, desire, and the spiritual obsession of a king. More than 2 decades before the cracks appeared, Catherine of Aragon arrived in England not as a discarded wife, but as a goddess of fortune from the south. The youngest daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the monarchs who unified Spain and financed Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492. Catherine carried within her the proudest royal blood in Europe. She came to England with an enormous dowry and a supreme political mission to strengthen the Anglo-Spanish alliance against France. In 1501, Catherine married Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry's elder brother. Arthur was a frail, sickly teenager, the complete opposite of his robust younger brother Henry. The marriage lasted only 5 months before the mysterious sweating sickness claimed Arthur's life at the remote Ludlow Castle. It was here that a secret began to germinate, one that would later shake the world. Had the marriage truly been consummated? According to the customs of the time, after the wedding night, Arthur emerged from the chamber and boldly declared, "Bring me a cup of wine, for last night I journeyed deep into the heart of Spain." It was the kind of boast typical of an adolescent boy. Yet Catherine, until her dying breath, swore beneath the cross that Arthur had merely lain beside her, that they spoke of family, and that he had never touched her body. The contradiction between the words of the dead and the oath of the living became the ghost that haunted the English throne for decades. When Arthur died, the Anglo-Spanish alliance stood on the brink of collapse. King Henry VII, notorious for his frugality, refused to return Catherine's massive dowry. A solution was proposed. Catherine would marry her younger brother-in-law, Henry, who was 6 years younger than she. However, Catholic law strictly forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow, based on the book of Leviticus. To bypass this prohibition, Henry VII pressured Pope Julius II to issue a special papal dispensation on the grounds that Catherine's first marriage had never been consummated. During the 7 years Henry had to wait to reach marriageable age, Catherine lived in neglect and near poverty in London. A strange detail emerged during this period. She began to adopt ascetic habits. Beneath her royal silks, she wore rough animal fur garments to mortify her body and spent hours kneeling on cold stone floors in prayer. This extreme piety was both her comfort and her armor, forging the stubborn resilience that would later define her fate. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, the young and charismatic king's first act was to marry Catherine immediately. Their early years were a radiant love story. Henry, who loved hunting, wrestling, and music, found in Catherine a true companion. Few people knew that Henry VIII possessed an unusually artistic temperament. He frequently composed music. The famous song, "Pastime with Good Company," is widely attributed to him, and often sang with Catherine in the royal gardens. Catherine was not only his wife, she was his most brilliant political advisor. When Henry went to war in France, he entrusted her with the royal seal, making her regent of England. She even donned armor and rode on horseback to rally troops against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, a powerful image that filled Henry with both admiration and a subtle sense of unease. Yet behind the glittering banquets and the love poems Henry scribbled in the margins of prayer books, a shadow began to spread. Children were born one after another, only to die within days or weeks. Henry, deeply superstitious, began to notice trivial signs: a stain on a crucifix, an omen in a dream, or simply the fact that Catherine was aging faster than he was. He began to believe that the ghost of Arthur still lingered in their bedroom, and that this was why God kept taking away his sons. Henry developed a peculiar habit of consulting astrological charts every morning, and when the stars seemed to suggest that the Tudor line would perish without a male heir, his once burning love for Catherine began to cool, replaced by a ruthless scheme disguised as a quest for spiritual purification. By the mid-1520s, Henry VIII's palace was no longer filled with music and laughter, but had become a morgue of shattered hopes. For Henry, the absence of a son was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a national crisis. The Tudor dynasty Henry ruled was, in truth, still fragile and young. His father, Henry VII, had seized the crown on the battlefield from the ashes of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict that had lasted more than 3 decades, from 1455 to 1487, in which noble houses slaughtered one another over the right to inherit the throne. Henry VIII understood that if he died without a strong male heir, England would once again be torn apart by ambitious nobles. It was precisely this fear that shaped one of the king's strangest and most extreme habits, an obsession with controlling his own body and health. Henry began ordering that every minor physical detail be recorded, from the color of his urine to the exact number of hours he slept each night. He believed his body was the embodiment of the kingdom itself. If he was healthy, yet produced no son, then the fault must lie with his wife, or worse, with divine punishment. Catherine of Aragon had been pregnant at least 6 times, yet the outcome was nothing but a series of quiet royal funerals. Each miscarriage or infant death drove Catherine deeper into the world of faith. She developed a habit that gradually began to unsettle Henry. Catherine spent hours praying in dark rooms without candlelight, punishing herself with prolonged fasting. Her beauty faded quickly, her face becoming increasingly somber and severe with devotion. The only surviving child, Princess Mary, was intelligent, but to Henry she was merely a bitter reminder of his failure to preserve the Tudor bloodline. Amid the heavy scent of incense and Catherine's melancholy piety, Anne Boleyn appeared like a lightning bolt shattering the stillness, and was not beautiful by traditional standards. She did not have pale skin, blue eyes, or golden hair. Her complexion was darker, her hair jet black, her gaze deep and piercing. What set Anne apart from Catherine was her unmistakable French flavor. After years serving at the French court, she returned to England with habits that drove noblemen to obsession. She knew how to play courtly games with provocative elegance, understood contemporary poetry, and carried herself with a confidence bordering on arrogance. Most intriguingly, Anne possessed a mysterious physical trait that rumor branded as a witch's mark, a prominent mole on her neck, or sometimes an extra piece of flesh on her hand that made it appear as if she had 6 fingers. Instead of hiding these features, and cleverly turned them into part of her enigmatic allure through specially designed clothing. Unlike the women before her who had easily fallen into the king's arms and pursued a ruthless and calculated strategy, absolute refusal, Henry, accustomed to obtaining everything he desired, was driven almost mad by Anne's rejection. In the famous love letters that survive to this day, once hidden in the Vatican Library, Henry wrote lines saturated with desire and even drew small hearts around Anne's name. Henry's habits changed completely under Anne's influence. He began neglecting affairs of state, spending entire days hunting with her and writing love letters at night, and planted a dangerous idea in his mind. If you marry me, God will grant you a son, but I will give myself to you only if I am your one and only queen. She skillfully exploited Henry's superstition, hinting that Catherine was cursed and that only a new, pure marriage with Anne could break the spell. This was no longer a secret affair. It was a coup in the bedroom and forced Henry into an irreversible choice: either lose her forever or overthrow the entire religious order of the old world to obtain his longed-for certificate of freedom. By the late 1520s, the dispute over the king's great matter was no longer confined to the secrecy of the court. It had become a great war of words, in which dust-covered Bibles were dragged out and sharpened into weapons. Henry VIII was not only a king, he was also an amateur scholar with an enormous sense of pride. Night after night, he buried himself in Latin translations of the Bible. A strange habit emerged during this period. Henry would underline passages in Leviticus with red ink and leave furious annotations in the margins. He clung to chapter 20, verse 21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. To Henry, this was not merely a law. It was a medical diagnosis. He believed the early deaths of his sons were the signature of God confirming that his marriage to Catherine was an incestuous crime. Henry developed the habit of washing his hands repeatedly and fumigating his bedroom with incense, as if trying to cleanse the uncleanness he believed he had carried for 18 years. To counter the king, bishops loyal to Rome and to Catherine delivered a fatal blow from another biblical book, Deuteronomy. It taught that if a man died without children, his brother must marry the widow to preserve the lineage. The contradiction between Leviticus and Deuteronomy created a theological black hole. Henry raged in fury and ordered envoys to travel across Europe's great universities, from Oxford to Bologna, to bribe scholars and force them to argue that Leviticus held superior authority. In June 1529, a special court convened at Blackfriars in London. For the first time in history, a king and queen stood before cardinals to have the legality of their marriage judged. There, Catherine of Aragon performed an act that stunned the entire hall into silence. Instead of sitting in the seat reserved for the accused, she rose, crossed the vast chamber, and knelt at Henry's feet. One stubborn yet noble habit of Catherine was that she always carried an old rosary inherited from her mother, Queen Isabella. She gripped it so tightly that her fingertips turned white, looked up at Henry, and spoke in a voice trembling yet resolute. "I beseech you, for the love that once existed between us, grant me justice. I am a poor wife, a stranger in your land. When I came to you, I swore before God that I was still a virgin, that I had never known any other man." This act was not merely a plea, it was a devastating psychological strike. Catherine knew that if she maintained her claim of virginity at the time of her marriage to Henry, then Henry's entire argument of incest based on Leviticus would collapse. Catherine possessed a secret habit that her ladies-in-waiting would reveal years later. Beneath her splendid robes at the trial, she wore a hair shirt, an instrument of self-mortification used by martyrs. She regarded this struggle as a battle to protect Henry's soul and her daughter Mary's right to inherit. Her steadfastness, combined with the deliberate delays of Cardinal Campeggio, pushed Henry into an extreme psychological state. When the court was suspended without a verdict, Henry realized that as long as the Pope remained under the influence of Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, he would never obtain his divorce. This theological deadlock gave rise to a new, darker habit in Henry. He began summoning lawyers instead of priests. He no longer wanted to search for truth in the Bible. He wanted to create a new legal order in which he himself would be the god of England. While Henry VIII was frantically turning the pages of scripture in London, in Rome Pope Clement VII was facing a nightmare even more terrifying: the survival of the papacy itself. Henry's divorce was not merely a matter of canon law. It was a slow-burning bomb at the heart of a Europe already engulfed in war. To understand why the Pope refused Henry so decisively, one must look at the context of 1527, the year Rome fell. The armies of Emperor Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, stormed and devastated the Eternal City in a brutal massacre. Pope Clement VII fled through a secret passageway to take refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo. There, he became, in effect, a prisoner of Charles V. One haunting historical detail is that during his captivity, Clement VII developed a strange habit. He never shaved his beard again. His long, unkempt beard became a symbol of mourning and humiliation endured by the Church. When Henry VIII's envoys arrived to seek an annulment, they were not facing a powerful representative of God, but a trembling, emaciated old man who constantly glanced toward the windows to see whether Charles V's soldiers were still watching. The real reason Clement VII could not agree to Henry's request was simple. Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. To Charles V, Henry's attempt to discard his aunt was not merely a divorce. It was a slap in the face of the Spanish royal house, the most powerful dynasty in the world at that time. Charles sent the Pope an unofficial but threatening message: if you allow this divorce, Rome will never know peace again. During this period, Charles V cultivated a habit that terrified his opponents: a dreadful silence. He rarely issued public statements about the divorce, but whenever Henry's envoys tried to approach Rome, they encountered an impenetrable wall of bureaucracy. Charles controlled every route leading to Rome, intercepted letters, and made Henry's voice increasingly isolated across the continent. Pope Clement VII was a master of delay. He never said no, but he also never truly said yes. He worked by a tactic diplomats called festina lente, make haste, slowly. There are telling details about the Pope's habits during audiences with English envoys. He would often pretend to have stomach pains or suddenly claim a fever just to postpone signing documents. He hoped time would cool Henry's rage, or that Anne Boleyn would fall out of favor, or that Catherine would simply die of old age. But across the English Channel, the delay backfired. Henry VIII, a man with a habit of smashing objects when his patience snapped, began to shift from hope to contempt for Rome. He developed a new habit, summoning prophets and astrologers to ask when the Pope would die. And when he finally understood Clement VII would never betray Charles V to help him, Henry drew a ruthless conclusion: if the Pope cannot give me what I want, then I will make myself the Pope. It was at this moment that Henry flipped the entire European chessboard. The Pope's stuck position inadvertently shoved England out of the Catholic orbit and cleared the path for a new force to rise: Thomas Cromwell, the man who would help Henry carry out one of the greatest breakaways in Western history. This is the detailed content for Chapter 5, the most explosive phase when Henry VIII officially divorced not only Catherine, but all of Rome, and built a separate religious empire of his own. By 1532, Henry VIII's patience had fully run out. Rome was still silent, and Anne Boleyn was beginning to lose patience as well. This was the moment Henry decided to take a step no English king before him had dared even to imagine: cutting the 1,000-year cord binding England to the Pope. If Henry was raw force, then Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer were the brain of the break. Cromwell, a man of low birth with the mind of an old fox, developed a habit that terrified the nobility. He kept a network of informants spread across London and wrote down every whispered word in a black leather notebook. Cromwell planted a seductive idea in Henry's ear: why should your grace kneel and beg an old man in Rome, when you could be an emperor in your own kingdom? Meanwhile, Thomas Cranmer, a cleric with reformist leanings, found a way to legalize the king's soul. It was Cranmer who secretly married Henry and Anne Boleyn while the marriage to Catherine had not yet been annulled, an audacity that, in another age, could have led straight to the stake. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy was formally passed. Henry VIII was no longer Rome's sheep. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Now Henry developed a habit of authority so extreme it bordered on obsession. He demanded that every subject, from peasants to dukes, swear an oath recognizing his marriage to and his supremacy. Refusal meant treason. Each morning, Henry would personally review the list of those who had not yet sworn, tapping his signet ring against the tabletop in a steady rhythm, like a death sentence waiting to be delivered. One of the most earth-shaking consequences of the break was the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry, perpetually short of cash for pleasure and war, saw an enormous treasure sitting inside the church. Under Cromwell's iron hand, more than 800 religious houses were dismantled across England and Wales between 1536 and 1541. And there are strange, fascinating details from this period. Henry developed a taste for collecting precious relics from the destroyed monasteries. He no longer worshipped them, but he was captivated by the beauty of jeweled gold chalices. Rumor claimed the king ordered tons of gold from saints' images melted down and struck into new coins stamped with his own face. The irony is almost unbearable. A king who claimed faith as the reason for his divorce now used sacred objects to enrich his personal fortune. Every revolution demands blood, and Henry's break took the lives of some of England's greatest minds. Sir Thomas More, Henry's close friend and former Lord Chancellor, refused to swear the oath because of an unbreakable Catholic conscience. On the night before his execution on July 6, 1535, More kept a habit that made Henry both furious and, against his will, impressed. He wrote letters with a piece of charcoal on scraps of paper, displaying an unsettling calm. When Thomas More's head was severed and mounted on London Bridge, Henry reacted in a way witnesses found strange. He did not eat for an entire day and locked himself in a dark room. Perhaps, somewhere deep inside, the king understood that to obtain his certificate of freedom and ultimate power, he had killed the last living piece of his own conscience. Anglicanism was not born from a deep theological reformation like Martin Luther's. It was born from political need and one man's appetite. Henry kept many Catholic rituals because he loved their grandeur, but he erased Rome's authority. Now Henry often dressed in garments embroidered with even more gold than before, as if to declare that he was not merely king, but a kind of king-priest. Yet the triumph did not last. The moment he achieved his goal, darkness began to fall over his new marriage to Anne Boleyn, because her womb still could not give him the healthy son he had traded his soul to obtain. As the aftershocks of the break slowly settled, every central figure in this drama was forced to face a brutal ending. And yet, from those ruins, a modern England began to take shape. Catherine of Aragon, steadfast to her final breath. Catherine was stripped of the title of queen, separated from her daughter Mary, and held under house arrest in damp castles like Kimbolton. And yet, until the very last moment, on January 7th, 1536, she maintained a habit Henry both hated and feared. In every letter, she signed her name Catherine the Queen. It is said that even on her sickbed she still tried to sew a shirt for Henry, a habit from the earliest days of their marriage. Her final letter to him did not contain hatred, but an oath. In the end, I vow that my eyes desire you above all things. When she died, an autopsy reported a strange black mass clinging around her heart. Those devoted to her claimed it was proof of a heart shattered by suffering. History, instead, remembered her as a symbol of unbreakable fidelity. Just 4 months after Catherine's death, Anne Boleyn also walked to the scaffold, executed on May 19, 1536. The ultimate irony was this, and the woman Henry had overturned the world to marry also could not give him a healthy son. Henry, with his habit of blaming fate and witchcraft, began to believe and had bewitched him. In her final days in the Tower of London, and formed a strange habit, she burst into wild laughter. When she learned she would be executed by sword in the French manner rather than the axe, she delivered a line that became famous. "I hear the executioner is very good, and I have such a small neck." Anne's death was proof that Henry could discard anything: faith, law, even the woman he once loved to the point of madness, if it no longer served his obsession with an heir. Henry VIII died in 1547 after marrying 4 more wives, still uneasy about what legacy he would leave behind. But history always writes the scripts no one can predict. The daughter Anne Boleyn gave him, Elizabeth I, once declared illegitimate by her own father, would become the monarch who sat longest and shone brightest on England's throne. Elizabeth inherited her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's cold decisiveness. She formed a habit remarkably similar to Henry's. She never fully trusted anyone, and she used marriage as a political weapon to manipulate all of Europe. Under Elizabeth, England became a naval power, and in 1588 it defeated the Spanish Armada, Spain ruled by the heirs of Catherine of Aragon, completing the religious revolution her father had set in motion. Looking back on this entire historical drama, it is astonishing to see that such immense transformations, the birth of Anglicanism, the collapse of Vatican power in England, the rise of England's Royal Navy, were all rooted in something intensely personal. A single passport out of a marriage, a document that would allow Henry VIII to wed again. Henry VIII did not intend to create a religious revolution out of ideals. He wanted a son, but in chasing desire and an obsession with power, he accidentally shattered the chains of the old feudal order and forced England to stand on its own. The divorce from Catherine of Aragon was not merely the end of a marriage. It was the gunshot that signaled the birth of a mighty English empire, where royal authority no longer lived in Rome's shadow. The story of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon is the clearest proof of an old truth. Sometimes one small personal act can shove the wheel of history onto an entirely different road. If you need me to help expand any segment in more detail, or if you want to move to another historical drama, just as explosive, like the clash between Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, or the mysteries of the Borgia family, I'm always ready.